I'm calling the cops on you right now." My HOA president shrieked these words at me the very moment my wife, Emily, arrived home after 8 long months serving on the USS Truman. Emily was still in her travel clothes, looking tired from her deployment and just wanted to find some peace. But this woman, our neighbor, clearly had different plans. She had called the police, accusing me of threatening behavior with a weapon while I was simply trimming our hedges. "I'm calling the cops on you right now." When the officers arrived, they looked ready to arrest a dangerous criminal. Then, my wife stepped out of the house. The second she revealed who she was, everything changed. The woman's face turned pale, and her world began to fall apart. The "Welcome Home, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez" sign had been up for exactly 3 hours before I knew I was living next to a monster. I had spent 8 months eagerly waiting for Emily to come back from her deployment, and I wanted her homecoming to be perfect. I had carefully painted the sign myself in our kitchen, using classy navy blue letters on a white background. It was respectful and simple, nothing flashy. Emily had been serving our country in the Middle East, and she deserved a hero's welcome. I hung it on our front porch with pride, picturing her tired but happy smile when she saw it. I never expected our neighbor to see it as a declaration of war. My name is Alex Martinez, and I work from home as an IT project manager in Riverside Heights, a quiet suburb outside of Phoenix. Emily and I bought our 3-bedroom ranch house here 3 years ago. With its small front yard, it seemed like the perfect place to start our family. The neighborhood was lovely, with tree-lined streets, well-kept homes, and a very active homeowners association, HOA, that made sure property values stayed high. We thought we had found our forever home, just 2 months before Emily was due back. I got a call from a company called Sterling Development. They offered to buy our house for a quick sale at a great price. I laughed it off and told the realtor that this was our dream house, and we weren't going anywhere. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to that call. The morning I hung the welcome sign, I was practically bouncing with excitement. I had taken the day off work, cleaned the house from top to bottom, and even bought Emily's favorite flowers for the kitchen table. Our neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Patterson, waved and smiled when she saw me decorating. "That's so sweet," she called out. "When does Emily get home?" I told her Emily's flight would land that evening, and Mrs. Patterson promised to bring over a casserole later. Everything felt normal and peaceful, just how a homecoming should be. Then, Maggie Stone appeared on my doorstep like a gathering storm cloud. Maggie was a 57-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood for over 10 years. She had been the HOA president for 2 terms straight, and everyone knew she took her job very seriously, perhaps too seriously. She was about 5 feet 6 inches, with her graying brown hair always pulled into a tight bun. She dressed like she was always on her way to a board meeting, even just to check her mail. When she showed up that morning, she didn't say hello or introduce herself. Instead, she stood on my sidewalk, pulled out her phone, and started taking pictures of my sign from every angle. She then took out a tape measure, which she had apparently brought just for this, and measured the distance from my porch to the street. The whole time, she had an expression on her face like she had just caught me in the middle of a crime. "Excuse me," I called out, stepping off my porch. "Is there a problem?" Maggie looked up from her phone, her eyes cold and calculating. Instead of answering me directly, she turned toward Mrs. Patterson's house and spoke loudly enough for the whole block to hear. "Some people think rules don't apply to them," she announced, still staring at my sign. "We'll see about that." Then, she turned on her heel and marched back to her house without another word. Mrs. Patterson and I exchanged confused looks from across the street. "What was that about?" she mouthed. I just shrugged, but a cold feeling settled in my stomach. The way Maggie had photographed my sign felt planned and threatening, like she was building a case against me. That evening, I picked Emily up from the airport. She looked exhausted but beautiful, still in her travel clothes with her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. When we pulled into our driveway, and she saw the sign, her face lit up with the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. "You made this?" she asked, her voice soft and full of emotion. I nodded, and she kissed me right there in the driveway, not caring if anyone was watching. "I missed you so much," she whispered. Once we were inside, I told her about the strange encounter with Maggie Stone. Emily listened with the focused attention of someone trained to identify threats. "Sounds like a control freak," she said. "Let's just stay under the radar for a while." I'm too tired to deal with neighborhood drama. At 11 p.m. that night, our Ring doorbell captured something that should have been my first real warning. The motion sensor went off, and there was Maggie Stone on my front walkway in her bathrobe and slippers, shining her phone's flashlight at my welcome sign. She had that same tape measure out and was carefully measuring the distance from my porch to the property line again, muttering to herself as she wrote in a small notebook. She stood there for almost 10 minutes, documenting every detail like a crime scene investigator. When I checked the footage the next morning, that cold feeling returned to my stomach. This wasn't just about a sign. This was about control, territory, and power. I showed the video to Emily over coffee, and I saw her military training kick in instantly. Her posture straightened, her eyes sharpened, and she studied the footage as if it were intelligence data. "This woman is planning something," Emily said quietly. "The question is, what?" At 8:15 a.m., my phone chimed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Violation Notice, Section 15.3, Unauthorized Signage." The war had officially begun. I thought removing the sign would end the madness, but I was dead wrong. The next morning, I quietly took down Emily's welcome sign before she woke up. I figured I should pick my battles, avoid making things worse, and let Maggie have her small victory. Emily found me in the kitchen folding the sign, and I could see the disappointment on her face. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I do," I replied. "I looked up the HOA rules last night. Technically, she's right about temporary signage." What I didn't tell Emily was that I'd also found something disturbing during my late-night research. The HOA's aesthetic guidelines had been changed just 3 weeks ago, right before Emily was scheduled to return. Every single rule my sign had supposedly broken was added or made stricter in that recent update, but taking down the sign didn't satisfy Maggie. If anything, it seemed to encourage her. Over the next week, violation notices flooded my email like clockwork. There was a $50 fine for a non-compliant doormat color because our navy blue mat apparently violated the new earth tone requirement. Then came a $75 fine for excessive planter height because our small flower pots were somehow 2 inches taller than the new maximum. A $100 fine for improper vehicle positioning claimed my truck was parked crooked in my own driveway. The most ridiculous fine was $25 for organic debris migration because leaves from our tree had blown onto the sidewalk. Asterisk, I started taking pictures of my driveway every morning to document my truck's perfect alignment, but somehow Maggie always found something wrong. The constant pressure was clearly designed to wear me down. Every morning brought a new email, a new fine, and a new reminder that I was being watched and judged. Emily noticed me checking my phone obsessively, and I could see her frustration growing. "This is harassment," she said after I showed her the latest notice for inconsistent lawn mowing patterns. She was right, but I felt trapped. Fighting back seemed like it would only make things worse, and I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. The fines were adding up quickly. We were already looking at over $400 in penalties for things that weren't even violations when we moved in. Frank Wilson, our neighbor from 2 houses down, stopped by one evening while I was watering my plants. Frank was a retired accountant in his late 60s, a soft-spoken man who usually kept to himself. "I saw Maggie measuring your property again today," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. "She did the same thing too. Me last year over my garden gnome. It cost me $500 in fines before I finally gave up and removed it." Asterisk, Frank's story hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about rule enforcement. This was systematic harassment. "How long has she been doing this?" I asked. Frank shrugged sadly. "Ever since her husband died and she became HOA president. Some people deal with grief by helping others. Maggie deals with it by controlling them." That same week, I noticed something else troubling. Frank mentioned that Sterling Development had contacted him too, just last week, with the same offer for a quick sale that I had received. "Weird timing," Frank mused. "They called right after Maggie started hassling you about the sign. It's almost like they knew there might be problems in the neighborhood." Pieces of the puzzle started clicking together in my mind, but I couldn't see the full picture yet. Sterling Development was actively trying to buy houses in our area, and Maggie Stone was making life miserable for homeowners. The timing felt too convenient to be a coincidence. The breaking point came on Thursday afternoon. I was replanting some flowers that had died while Emily was away when I heard loud voices from my front yard. I looked up to see Maggie standing on my walkway, not quite on my property, but close enough to feel invasive. She wasn't alone. She had Mrs. Patterson and another neighbor with her, and she was speaking loudly enough for the entire block to hear. "I'm the HOA president," she announced, pointing at my flower pots. "These people need to follow the rules like everyone else. I'll call the police if I have to." Mrs. Patterson looked uncomfortable, clearly caught in the middle of something she wanted no part of. The other neighbor actually started recording with her phone, which seemed to make Maggie even more agitated. Emily heard the commotion from inside and came to the front window. Through the glass, I could see her watching the scene unfold with the sharp focus of someone trained to handle threats. Her military bearing was unmistakable, even from a distance: straight posture, alert eyes, hands relaxed but ready. She had spent 8 months dealing with real threats in a war zone, and now she was watching a middle-aged HOA president throw a tantrum on our front lawn. When Maggie finally stormed off, muttering about people who think they're above the law, Emily opened the front door. "That woman needs to be taught a lesson," she said, her voice firm. I wanted to agree, but I was afraid of what would happen if we pushed things further. That night, Emily and I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by printed emails and HOA documents. "Look at this pattern," Emily said, her military training evident in how she organized the evidence. Every single rule she's citing was changed 3 weeks ago. She planned this whole campaign before I even got home. The realization was chilling. This wasn't random harassment or a personal dislike. This was a coordinated attack with a clear timeline and objectives. "But why?" I asked. Emily studied the timeline she'd created, her mind working through the possibilities, as if she were analyzing enemy intelligence. "I don't know yet," she said finally, "but I have a feeling we're about to find out." On Friday morning, our new reality of HOA harassment continued. Emily had been home for 10 days, and we had developed a routine of checking for new violation notices with our morning coffee. "Only 2 today," I announced, scrolling through my email. "Improper hedge trimming angle and unauthorized bird feeder placement." Emily shook her head in amazement. "I've served in combat zones less stressful than this neighborhood," she said, half joking, but I could hear the frustration in her voice. My wife had spent 8 months protecting our country's interests, and now she couldn't even enjoy peace in her own backyard. The absurdity of it all was starting to wear on both of us that I decided to spend the morning doing yard work, partly because the weather was perfect and partly because I was determined not to let Maggie control every aspect of our lives. I grabbed my hedge trimmers and started working on the bushes along our front walkway. The physical activity felt good after weeks of stress, and for the first time in days, I was actually relaxing. Our hedges weren't overgrown, but I figured if I kept them perfectly manicured, maybe Maggie would run out of things to complain about. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. As I worked, I could see Emily through our living room window, unpacking the last of her deployment gear. She looked peaceful for the first time since coming home, and that made me happy to at exactly 10:37 a.m. I know the time because I had just checked my phone. I heard sirens in the distance. They got louder and louder until 2 police cars turned onto our street. I assumed they were heading somewhere else, perhaps for a break-in or a domestic dispute. Then, they pulled into my driveway. I stood there holding my hedge trimmers, completely confused, as 2 uniformed officers got out of their patrol cars, walking up from the direction of her house. Behind them was Maggie Stone. She had a satisfied expression on her face, like someone who had just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. The first officer was young, maybe in his late 20s, with a serious look that suggested he took his job very seriously. "Sir, we received a call about a disturbance," he said, his hand resting on his radio. "Someone reported aggressive behavior with a weapon." I looked down at the hedge trimmers in my hands and felt a mix of disbelief and anger. "These?" I asked, holding up the garden tool. "Someone called about hedge trimmers?" The second officer, who was older and more experienced, studied the scene with skeptical eyes. Meanwhile, Maggie positioned herself behind the police cars, acting as if she needed protection from a dangerous criminal. "I felt threatened," she announced loudly. "He was acting very aggressively with those shears." That's when Emily came outside. She had heard the sirens and voices, and her military instincts had kicked in. She emerged from our front door wearing simple civilian clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and sneakers, but there was something unmistakably authoritative about her. She moved with the confident stride of someone used to being in command, someone who had faced real danger and knew how to handle a crisis. The officers noticed her immediately, and I could see them trying to size up the situation. Was she a threat, a witness, or just a curious neighbor? Maggie, still standing behind the patrol cars, pointed dramatically in Emily's direction. "There," she said, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. She always looked suspicious, too. The younger officer stepped forward, his demeanor professional but cautious. "Ma'am, we're investigating a reported disturbance. Can I see some identification, please?" Emily nodded calmly and reached for her wallet. There was no anxiety in her movements, no defensiveness or anger, just the steady competence of someone who had dealt with authority figures in much more serious situations. She opened her wallet and handed over her ID card. The officer glanced at it, then looked again, more carefully this time. His entire expression changed in the span of about 3 seconds. He straightened his posture, and his voice took on a completely different tone. "Lieutenant Colonel Emily Rodriguez, USS Truman?" he asked. Now, there was respect in his voice, not suspicion. "Yes, sir," Emily replied simply. "I just got back from deployment last week." The transformation in both officers was immediate and dramatic. The younger one actually took a small step back and nodded respectfully. The older officer moved closer to get a better look at Emily's military ID, and I could see recognition dawning on his face. "Ma'am, thank you for your service," the older officer said sincerely. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan myself." "When did you get back?" Emily smiled for the first time since the police had arrived. 10 days ago. I'm still getting used to being home." The atmosphere had completely shifted. What started as a tense confrontation had become a respectful conversation between fellow service members. Meanwhile, Maggie's triumphant expression was melting into confusion and then alarm. This wasn't going according to her script. The police weren't arresting anyone or issuing citations. Instead, they were having a friendly chat with the woman she had described as suspicious. The older officer turned toward Maggie with a much less friendly expression. "Ma'am, can you explain exactly what aggressive behavior you witnessed?" Maggie stammered for a moment, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. He had those shears. He looked threatening. The officer glanced at me, still holding my hedge trimmers, and then back at Maggie. "Sir, were you trimming your hedges on your own property?" he asked me. "Yes, officer, just doing some yard work." The officer nodded and turned back to Maggie, his expression now decidedly unfriendly. "Ma'am, this appears to be a false report," the officer said firmly. "Filing false police reports is a crime, and it wastes resources that could be used for actual emergencies." Maggie's face turned red, and I could see her starting to panic. "False report?" I felt threatened. "This is discrimination." She was getting louder and more agitated, attracting attention from neighbors who were starting to come out of their houses to see what was happening. The older officer remained calm but stern. "Ma'am, I'm issuing you a formal warning. Any future calls of this nature will be thoroughly investigated, and charges may be filed." Maggie looked around desperately, as if searching for support from the growing crowd of neighbors. "I want to speak to your supervisor. This is unfair. I know my rights." The scene that followed was pure neighborhood drama gold. Maggie Stone, the self-appointed queen of Riverside Heights, was having a complete meltdown in front of half the block. She demanded to speak to the police officer's supervisor, insisted she was being discriminated against, and threatened to report everyone to various authorities. The more she ranted, the more ridiculous she looked. Our neighbor with the phone was still recording, and several other people had come outside to watch the show. Mrs. Patterson looked mortified on Maggie's behalf. Emily and I exchanged glances, and I could see she was fighting not to smile. After 8 months of dealing with actual threats and real emergencies, watching someone have a tantrum over hedge trimmers probably seemed pretty absurd. After the police left and the neighbors went back inside, Emily and I went into the house and burst out laughing. The whole situation was so ridiculous that we couldn't help ourselves. "I cannot believe she called the cops on you for trimming hedges," Emily said, wiping tears from her eyes. "In Afghanistan, we called in airstrikes for less than that." We spent the rest of the day in the best mood we'd had since she got home. For the first time, Riverside Heights felt peaceful again. Mrs. Patterson brought over another plate of cookies later, apologizing for Maggie's behavior and welcoming Emily home properly. That woman has been out of control for months, Mrs. Patterson confided. Maybe now she'll think twice before harassing people. We went to bed that night thinking our problems with Maggie Stone were over. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Saturday morning brought a new kind of nightmare. A courier delivered legal papers to our front door. They were official documents from Blackstone and Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in Phoenix. The lawsuit was HOA of Riverside Heights versus Alex and Emily Martinez, and it cited defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit demanded $15,000 in damages, plus attorney's fees. Emily stared at the papers in disbelief. She's using the HOA's money to sue us, she said quietly. She's using our neighbors' money to pay for lawyers to attack us. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Maggie hadn't been defeated yesterday. She'd been humiliated. And now, she was escalating to a level I never could have imagined. The legal papers felt like a declaration of war, and Maggie wasted no time claiming victory. By Sunday morning, she was making her rounds through the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen about her brilliant legal strategy. I watched from my kitchen window as she cornered the mailman, a delivery driver, and 3 different neighbors, explaining how she was teaching troublemakers a lesson about respecting community standards. Her voice carried across our quiet street as she proclaimed, "Some people think they can intimidate HOA leadership, but they're about to learn otherwise. They'll have to pay thousands in legal fees just to prove I was wrong," which I wasn't. The psychological warfare was working just as she intended. Several neighbors who had previously been friendly now avoided our eyes when they saw us outside. Emily spent most of Sunday reading through the lawsuit documents with the careful attention she had learned in the military. She spread the papers across our dining room table, making notes and highlighting key sections as if she were analyzing enemy intelligence. "This is sophisticated harassment," she concluded after hours of study. "Whoever wrote this knows exactly how to maximize our legal costs while minimizing their own risk." The demands were carefully crafted to be just reasonable enough that a judge might not dismiss them right away, but expensive enough to bankrupt us if we fought them. A $15,000 claim plus attorney's fees could easily reach twice that amount. For a working-class family like ours, it might as well have been $1 million. The breaking point came on Monday evening. Emily had been home for 2 weeks, but instead of enjoying our reunion, she was falling asleep every night surrounded by legal documents and violation notices. I found her passed out on the couch again, still in her day clothes, with a highlighter in her hand and HOA bylaws scattered around her like battle plans. She looked exhausted in a way that 8 months of deployment hadn't. Watching my wife, who had served our country with honor, being broken down by a neighborhood bully was more than I could bear. "Emily," I said softly, gently shaking her awake. "Maybe we should just sell the house and move somewhere else." Emily sat up slowly, her military training evident even in the way she woke up, alert and focused in an instant. "What did you say?" she asked quietly. That I took a deep breath and voiced the thought that had been growing in my mind for days. "Sterling Development offered us a quick sale 2 months ago. Maybe we should call them back, take whatever they're offering, and just leave." Emily stared at me for a long moment, and I could see something change in her expression. Her posture straightened, her jaw set with determination, and suddenly, I was looking at the officer who had commanded respect in combat zones around the world. "Alex Martinez," she said firmly. "I didn't serve 15 years in the United States Navy to come home and let bullies win. This is our home, and we're not running away." That's when Frank Wilson knocked on our door. Frank had been keeping a low profile since Maggie's police incident, but tonight, he looked determined. He carried a manila folder thick with documents, and his usual mild manner had been replaced by quiet anger. "I've been doing some research," he announced as we invited him in. "About Maggie Stone, about the HOA finances, and about some very suspicious coincidences in our neighborhood." Frank spread his documents on our kitchen table with the precision of someone who had spent decades organizing financial records. "HOA fees increased by 40% this year," he began. Maggie claimed it was for legal expenses and community improvements. But you're the first resident she's actually sued, and I haven't seen any improvements anywhere. Frank's revelation was just the beginning. He pulled out phone records showing multiple calls from Sterling Development to various residents over the past 6 months, always offering quick sales at below market prices. They called me 3 times. Frank explained. Each time, they seemed to know about problems I was having with HOA violations. How would a development company know about our internal neighborhood issues? The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more disturbing than I'd imagined. Sterling Development wasn't just randomly trying to buy houses. They were specifically targeting residents who were having problems with Maggie. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. But Frank had saved the most important piece of information for last. I've been tracking Maggie's email usage on the HOA computer system, he said quietly. As treasurer, I have access to all HOA digital communications. 2 months ago, someone used the HOA computer to access external email accounts, including yours, Alex. The room went silent as the implications sank in. Emily leaned forward with an intensity she usually reserved for military briefings. You're saying she accessed Alex's personal email? Frank nodded grimly. That Sterling Development offer you received? It was marked as important in your email system, but you told me you never marked it that way. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they created was uglier than any of us had thought. Emily stood up and began pacing our kitchen with the restless energy of someone planning a military operation. She's been planning this for months, Emily said, her voice taking on the commanding tone I'd heard her use with subordinates. The rule changes, the harassment campaign, even the timing of the police incident, it's all been coordinated. Frank and I watched as Emily's military training took over completely. She wasn't the tired veteran worn down by legal papers. She was Lieutenant Colonel Emily Rodriguez, and she was angry. Frank, what access do residents have to the HOA financial records? Frank smiled for the first time all evening. As homeowners, we have the legal right to audit the HOA finances. All we need is a formal request signed by multiple residents. The plan came together quickly. Frank would organize a secret meeting with other residents who had been targeted by Maggie's harassment. Emily would use her military investigation skills to analyze the HOA financial records for any wrongdoing. I would document everything we discovered and prepare our evidence for whatever came next. This isn't just about us anymore, Emily declared. If Maggie Stone is running some kind of scam with Sterling Development through HOA harassment, she's victimizing our entire community. Frank gathered his documents with obvious satisfaction. I've been waiting 2 years for someone to stand up to her, he said. Ever since she fined me $500 for that garden gnome and made me feel like a criminal in my own neighborhood. As Frank prepared to leave, Emily stopped him at the door. Frank, this could get ugly. If we're right about what she's doing, Maggie won't go down without a fight. Frank squared his shoulders with unexpected determination. Colonel Rodriguez, I'm 72 years old. I survived 3 decades of corporate accounting and 2 years of Maggie Stone's tyranny. I think I can handle whatever comes next. After Frank left, Emily and I sat in our kitchen making plans. For the first time since she'd come home, Emily looked energized and focused. Tomorrow, we start fighting back, she announced. And when we're done, everyone will know exactly who Maggie Stone really is. The meeting was set for Saturday evening. As people gathered, the tension was thick, like the air before a big storm. Emily spent the day preparing her presentation with the same careful precision she used for military briefings, organizing the evidence into 3 clear categories: harassment, fraud, and conspiracy. This isn't about revenge, she told me as she loaded her laptop. This is about justice and protecting our community from someone who has been systematically victimizing her neighbors. Frank had done his job well. Every resident in Riverside Heights had received a notice about the emergency HOA meeting, and the community center was packed beyond capacity. Folding chairs filled every available space, and people stood along the walls. The energy in the room felt electric, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something important. Maggie Stone arrived fashionably late, dressed in her best business suit and carrying a leather portfolio, clearly prepared for a battle. She had even brought her own PowerPoint presentation titled Defending Community Standards, a response to false accusations. Her confidence was unshakable as she worked the room before the meeting, shaking hands and speaking in low, serious tones about troublemakers who want to destroy property values and the importance of supporting elected leaders. Several residents nodded along with her, and I realized Maggie still had supporters who believed her side of the story. This wasn't going to be the easy victory I had hoped for. Frank called the meeting to order with an authority I'd never heard from him before. "We're here tonight because serious questions have been raised about the HOA's financial management and the enforcement of our community standards," he announced. "As homeowners, we have the right to examine how our money is being spent and whether our elected officials are serving the community's best interests." Maggie stood up immediately, her voice carrying across the room. "This is clearly harassment, orchestrated by residents who refuse to follow basic community guidelines," she declared. "I won't be intimidated by troublemakers who want to undermine legitimate HOA authority." The room buzzed with murmurs as I saw people choosing sides in real time. Emily then stood and moved to the front of the room with the commanding presence that had served her so well in military leadership roles. "I'd like to present evidence that I believe every resident should see before making any judgments," she said simply. Her tone was calm, professional, and completely free of emotion, just as she had learned to brief superior officers on sensitive matters. Maggie's confident expression wavered slightly as Emily connected her laptop to the projection screen. "I object to this proceeding," Maggie shouted. "This is character assassination, and I won't stand for it." Frank consulted his copy of the HOA bylaws and calmly shook his head. According to Section 12, any resident has the right to present evidence relevant to HOA operations during official meetings. "Please continue, Colonel Rodriguez." The first part of Emily's presentation focused on the harassment. The screen filled, with a timeline showing Maggie's pattern of sudden rule changes followed by strict enforcement against specific residents. Emily played the audio from the 911 call where Maggie reported me for threatening with a weapon, followed by the police. Body cam footage that clearly showed me just trimming hedges in my yard. "This is the level of threat that justified calling emergency services," Emily said dryly, and a ripple of nervous laughter went through the audience. Maggie's face was turning red, but she stayed silent as Emily presented one violation notice after another for increasingly absurd infractions. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The second part of the presentation revealed the financial fraud. Emily displayed the invoices from Stone Quality Services next to the business registration records, showing the company's address was Maggie's home. She then showed side-by-side comparisons of the service dates on the invoices with the Ring doorbell footage, which proved that no work had ever been done. The most damning evidence came when Emily showed Maggie's social media posts celebrating expensive purchases on the exact same dates that Stone Quality Services had billed the HOA for emergency services. The room erupted in angry murmurs as residents realized their HOA fees had been funding Maggie's lavish lifestyle. "That's my money paying for her designer handbags," someone shouted from the back. Maggie finally found her voice again, standing up with pretend outrage. "I have every right to spend my personal money however I choose," she declared. But her words only made things worse. The third and final part of the evidence destroyed any remaining support Maggie might have had. Emily presented sterling developments, plans for their luxury community, highlighting how the project needed specific properties for road access. She then showed the email correspondence between Maggie and Sterling, which laid out the systematic plan to pressure residents into selling their homes below market value through HOA harassment. The room fell silent as Emily played an audio recording of Maggie's voice from a phone call, discussing problem properties and financial pressure tactics with Sterling's acquisition team. Rodriguez property resistance stronger than expected. Maggie's voice echoed through the community center, increasing pressure through legal costs and violation enforcement. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank stood up slowly, his face grave with the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. "Based on this evidence, I motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in Maggie Stone as HOA President," he announced. "All in favor?" Hands shot up throughout the room. Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher, both couples from the back rows, and even several people who had been nodding along with Maggie earlier. The vote was overwhelming, 28 for removal, with only Maggie herself voting against. "Motion carries," Frank declared. "Maggie Stone is hereby removed from all HOA positions, effective immediately." The room erupted in applause, but Maggie wasn't finished. "You'll all regret this," she screamed, her composure completely shattered. "I'll sue every single person in this room. This is discrimination against successful women who know how to get things done." Her meltdown was spectacular and publicly witnessed by the entire community she had tried to control. "I'll have my lawyers destroy all of you," she continued, pointing wildly around the room. "Sterling Development will find another way to get what they want, and you'll all wish you'd supported me when you had the chance." Her threats only confirmed everything Emily had presented, and several residents were now recording her outburst on their phones. Frank remained calm throughout her tantrum, consulting his bylaws and waiting for her to exhaust herself. "I'm also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for an investigation of fraud and conspiracy charges," Emily announced once Maggie had finally fallen silent. "And I'll be sending copies of all evidence to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, since this appears to involve interstate commerce and systematic fraud." The legal implications were serious and immediate. Maggie's face went pale as she realized the full consequences of what had been exposed. This wasn't just about losing her HOA position. She was facing potential federal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of her position. Sterling Development would also face an investigation for their role in the systematic harassment of residents. 6 months later, I'm writing this story from my home office, looking out at the for sale sign in front of Maggie's house. She moved out 3 months ago, just ahead of the federal fraud charges that are still pending. Sterling Development's Sunset Meadows project was canceled after their business practices came under investigation. Frank Wilson was elected as our new HOA president, and he immediately cut monthly fees by 35% while improving actual community services. Emily's welcome home sign is back on our porch, now joined by a smaller sign that reads, "This home stands for truth." Mrs. Patterson brought us another casserole last week, and our new neighbors wave hello when they walk their dog past our house. Riverside Heights finally feels like the community we thought we were moving into 3 years ago. Peaceful, friendly, and governed by people who actually care about their neighbors rather than their own power.